What up, everybody? Nikolai here, the Selenium expert, ready to teach you guys how to become experts at identifying elements using Selenium WebDriver. In fact, I'm going to teach you how to become experts at identifying any elements with any tool, but our focus is obviously on Selenium WebDriver. So, what you're going to master through this section is you're going to learn some basics of the HTML, just so you have a little foundational understanding of what's going on. You're going to learn a lot of XPath expressions, because XPath is going to be our main key to identifying our elements with Selenium WebDriver. Therefore, I'm going to teach you guys to be excellent at it. And finally, overall goal of this course is to make you guys amazing in identifying any elements with any tools, anytime, doesn't matter what it is, again with the focus of utilizing Selenium WebDriver. Now, there are some prerequisites to this part of the course. You obviously need the code, which you can get here on github.com/nadvolod/lightpom for page object model framework tutorial. That's the code with some samples of that we're going to be going through. You're going to need the Selenium IDE, which looks like that. You're going to need Firefox installed. You're going to need Firebug installed and FirePath installed. If you don't know how to install any of those, then you need to go back and watch the portion of the course that talks about how to install all of these. Oh, and also you're going to need Visual Studio, because we're going to be writing code in C# for Selenium WebDriver. So you obviously need Visual Studio IDE to help you write that code. Also, I would recommend that you just have a very basic understanding of Selenium IDE and Selenium WebDriver. If you don't, this might be a little bit harder for you to understand. So go back and review those sections of the course before proceeding any further, because you don't want to be running before you learn how to walk, right? That's not how it works. First you crawl, then you walk, then you run. So don't jump into the running right away. Learn how to crawl by getting your basics down. So go check out that portion if you don't have anything installed, and if you need to get familiar a little bit with Selenium IDE and Selenium WebDriver and Visual Studio. And afterwards you'll be ready to proceed. Some other extra resources that you may want to reference through portions of this course is W3 Schools, which is excellent for teaching you HTML and XPath. So you can go ahead, check those out on your own if you feel like you need more resources. However, my goal is to make you guys phenomenal at identifying elements. So hopefully, if I do my job right, you won't really need those resources. But if you do, and you just want to be that super overachiever, then that's where you can go, w3schools/html or w3schools.com/xsl/xpath_nodes.asp. And as always, before we proceed, I love to start out with an inspirational quote, just to motivate you guys and light a fire under your butts to get you going and working. Today's quote is brought to you by Ralph Waldo Emerson, one of the greatest writers in the world. And he says that our greatest glory is not never failing, but in rising up every time we fail. And I think that it's so true, because a lot of people that I've seen in the industry, and myself included, we are so scared to fail. We are so scared to make mistakes, to do something wrong, when in fact we should not be. Because as he says, our greatest glory is not in the failure, but in rising up. Every time we fail, every time we do make a mistake, we rise up, we pick ourselves back up, and we continue. We don't give up. Anytime we come across something tough that we're learning with Selenium WebDriver, we don't give up. We master it. we work at it one day at a time, 1 minute at a time, until we fully understand everything. Don't get discouraged, guys. There's a lot of tough topics here that we're going to be covering, and they are new to almost everybody, I'm sure. So do not get discouraged. Just keep at it. Rise up from your failures. You will become strong. You will become amazing. I believe in you. There was a point in time where I knew absolutely nothing about any of this as well. And yes, it was freaking tough to learn all of it. And I'm still learning it every single day. I am no master by any means. But what I do well is I continue to work at it every single day, improve my skills, and anywhere that I feel like I'm failing, I improve upon those failures. And I want you to do the same. Don't quit, and you'll be the best that you can be. So with all that said, let's go ahead and jump in to our lessons. One other place that I want to turn your attention to is this website here, qtptutorial.net/automation-practice. This page is going to become your best friend for learning automated software testing with whatever tool. It's still a baby and it's still growing, but we are constantly adding new elements to this page to make it amazing for you guys so that you can actually practice multiple types of different automation testing techniques on different web elements. So for example, you can practice identification using HTML properties. You can practice simple controls. There's different advanced controls. There's scenarios. There's XPath help. There's identifying non-unique objects, playing videos. And we're going to continue to add more and more to this over time. So it's going to become an extensive library that you're going to be able to use to practice your automated software testing. So come here, enjoy. It's all free. Just come to this link and access it and do what you want. So why I brought this page up is because we need to talk about HTML a little bit. Yes, I know that we're not developers, but we are automation engineers, and we need a little bit of knowledge just about HTML to understand it and so that we can do our jobs better. So HTML, many of you may know, many of you may not, is what holds the contents of this web page. In fact, it holds the contents of all the web pages. And you guys can see when I press F12 of my Chrome Webdriver tools, I get this thing here. And inside of that, I can see the entire HTML document. This is just a simple file, and inside of that live all of our elements, right? As you guys can see, as I hover over each of these elements, we get different stuff highlighted in the page. Scripts aren't going to do anything. Images. And so this is what represents the web page. When it gets rendered by the engine, it displays this because it reads this text. Just like with C#, we write code, and then when the compiler executes that code, it knows what to do because it understands that code. And so that's HTML. We don't really need to dig in any deeper, but we do need to look at a few things about HTML. So HTML has what we call tags, and these tags, they enclose some content. And tags, they usually come in pairs. There's a start tag and an end tag. The only difference between the start tag and the end tag is this line right here. But you can see that it's the exact same string, and then with a /, this tells it that it's the end tag. So let's take a look at our website for that example. I actually brought up the same site here in Firefox just because it's a little bit more user-friendly with Firebug here. And then when pressing F12, it opens developer tools, and that gives me access to Firebug. And then I can do cool things like this, like select which element I want to work with. So for example, if I click on this one, in the HTML, all this stuff leads to this element which is highlighted. And you can see when I highlight over it in the HTML, it also highlights in the web page, okay? And so you guys can see here, input is the tag, and it's closed by another input tag. But you can see here in shorthand, you can also do this. So it opens with this caret and closes with a / caret. For the form, for example, you can see that's another tag. Form is the tag, start tag, and then this is the end tag. And so inside of this form, we have an element. We also have many divs, right? You can see if I hover over this div, in yellow, we have some stuff that live inside of this div, and that is the content. So this div, this form, this input, these are all called tags. Now, in HTML, there are also things called attributes. And attributes are used to provide additional information about a certain element. The attributes are also always specified in the start tag. So for example, we have our tag right here, right? Start tag, end tag, and here is an attribute. And actually, an attribute is what a lot of us are used to using to identify elements. Probably if you're coming from a QTP background, unknowingly, because they have that sweet object spy, we have been using attributes a lot of the time to identify our elements. For example, ID, and then its value. And then obviously we have the content inside of here. So this right here is an attribute, and there are many different types of attributes. Let's go back to our page to take a look. So look at this. Right here, this button has an ID. Its attribute is ID, and then here's the attribute's value, ID example, enclosed in double quotes. Here's actually another attribute that it has. It's a type of submit, and it has even a third attribute called value, and then that value also has a string. We can look at another element. Look, this one is going to have a class. So instead of an ID, its attribute is a class, and then there's the class value. We can take a look at another button. This one has a name property. Check it out. The other ones didn't have a name. This one has a name. And then it also has a type and a value, just like all the other buttons. What if we take a look at this link? Look at it. The link, it has a tag of A, right? And then you guys will see over here, this is the closing tag. And then it has a href property, which tells us that it's a link. And then it has this value, which when we click on it, it's obviously going to take us to location, which was link success, which was exactly what was specified in the HTML. You guys see that? And then of course it has the text that fits into this tag. Again, take a look at some of these examples here. So we have our tag, opening tag, our closing tag, and then, sorry, this is the opening tag, right? Because the attribute always goes into the opening tag, and then there's also the closing tag, which I didn't put in here. But then we have the attribute and this value. So for example, we can have an h1 tag, and that tag has a property value of ID, and then the ID has a value of ID value. We can have a div tag, and that has a name property, and its value is value. And we can even have an image tag, and then that has a source property, and that has a value. Now, what you guys may see here is that each of these tags and properties may have some meaning, and that's exactly correct, right? They're like keywords in a programming language, right? When you guys have been learning C# and learning all those keywords, like, for example, public, void, static, main, string, array, all of those are unique keywords, right, that have some meaning to C#. Well, in HTML, all of these things also have some meaning in HTML. So h1 is a header tag. h2 is another header tag, but it's a lower level header tag. img means that it's an image, and usually it comes with a source tag that has the location of the image. And inside of that, we can even have some text. So all of those have some meaning, which is not really too relevant for you guys because you guys are not going to be designing actual web pages. But what you just have to understand is what I described here, is that we have our tags. The tags have properties that have some values, and using the tags and values and combination of those, we can start identifying our elements. Okay, so next thing that I want you guys to do is open Selenium IDE so that we can just play around with it a little bit. I want to show you guys something cool. So to get your Selenium IDE, all you have to do is go to developer, and then you'll have that Selenium IDE button, which you can also get to with Alt Control S. So I'm going to click that. You guys see this opens, and I'm going to put my web page on the side and my Selenium IDE on the side as well, so they're equal partners in this relationship. But actually I want Selenium IDE to be a little bit smaller, this a little bit bigger. So what you can see right now is Selenium IDE is recording, and that's okay. So what I'm going to do with it is I'm going to click on this button, and you guys can see that right away I got some code in the Selenium IDE. Let me stop recording, go back here, and look back on this page. So Selenium IDE is a nice theoretical tool used to create automated tests, right? People use it to pitch, record, and playback because it's so easy, but in the long term, it is not maintainable at all. Don't ever think of using it. And if you're taking my course and you're using this tool, I'm going to be very angry, and me and you will have a serious chat. But the reason I like Selenium IDE is it kind of gives you a good introduction to how to identify elements with Selenium WebDriver. So for example, I can come over here to the commands, and I can open this up, and I can see a bunch of commands that Selenium IDE has. So if I want to do something like a highlight, I can click highlight, and then if I do the if I do right click and then execute command, it should highlight. Go up, did it highlight? Click X to highlight. There it is. Okay, so X, you guys see highlighting in bright yellow on the right side, this button. That's awesome, right? And you guys can see that using this highlight command and this target, which is ID equals ID example, I am able to highlight this element. And there's many other commands which obviously translate well into Selenium WebDriver, but those aren't important. The other cool thing here is this reference, which obviously tells you how a command works. And then there's also a log that helps you to understand what it's doing. So if I'm selecting this line and then looking at the log, and then I click X, logs the fact that I was highlighting an ID example, and if it fails, it comes out to the log as well. Now, if we want to change the element that we want to click on, we can click the select button, and for example, let's try this one. You guys see how it's selecting? And it popped up this target value for us to locate our elements. So that's why Selenium IDE can be cool sometimes, because it can help you identify an element and show you how to identify it. In fact, there are many different ways to identify this single element. In this case, it's use CSS. You can also use XPath, XPath, and XPath in all of these cases. So, for example, let me leave this, and then if I do a X on this command, it should highlight that button. You guys see that? It did. Do it again. See that? But if I change to another identifier like this, it should also be able to do that. By hitting the X button, I can see that it's highlighting that element. So what this is showing you is a few of the possible ways that Selenium can use to identify an element. And even further, it's showing you some hints as to the values that you can use with Selenium WebDriver. The reason that I'm showing you guys all of this is because, unfortunately, Selenium does not have a nice way to identify elements. Unlike something like a QTP that has that nice little object spy, Selenium does not have that. Therefore, what happens is you spend most of your time, well, I shouldn't say most of your time, you spend a good portion of your time trying to identify elements. If the elements are easy to identify and the developers did a good job in making your application testable, then that time is almost negligible. However, if they did not do a good job helping you to automate the application, then you're going to spend a ton of time identifying web elements. And although that sucks, it's completely the opposite for something like a QTP, right? Where you don't spend a lot of time identifying elements because they have the nice object spy, but you spend a crap load of time coding because VB script is such a weak language. So if you want to do something like click a button and wait for it, you have to write a shit ton of lines of code in order to make that happen. So it's kind of the trade-off, right? Maybe one day Selenium will add a nice object identification tool, but until then, we use tools like Selenium IDE just to get a little bit familiar, and FirePath and Firebug to help us identify. And once we learn all the skills that I'm teaching you guys in this course, you really won't care whether you have an object identification tool or not, because you guys are just going to be machines at identifying elements. So having this IDE tool is nice, but the reason that you can't always use it is because it doesn't always work, or it doesn't always give you the most efficient identifier. For example, let's look at these two buttons over here. If you look at this one, Selenium first tells you to identify this button using this XPath, which is actually pretty excellent. However, the only reason it knows how to do that is because I gave these two buttons two different texts so that you guys can differentiate. But if you imagine that these are just like login buttons, right? One login button is in like the upper right corner, and another login button is maybe in the bottom right corner of the application. And if they're both called login and they both do exactly the same thing, they're just located at different spots in the HTML. So we can actually do that by looking here. This will give us kind of a, this is not an absolute path, but a partial path. Here's a relative one. So here's one that's a little bit better. I'm going to copy this. I'm going to put that in there. And then I want to look at the XPath button too. Right, again, it does a good job in selecting that. But then if I come here and then select that, go to my Notepad++ and paste that here, you guys can see that this XPath is almost exactly the same, except for this is form number 2 and this is form number 1. So what if any of these buttons were to change, right? If one button moved to one location, another moved to a different location, these absolute XPaths would no longer be good because this would not get you to the right object. Therefore, you have to learn the proper way to identify the elements, which would be in this case using something like this. And in this case, Selenium IDE did a great job in showing you guys that. But you should be able to pick that out on your own using the skills that I will teach you, so that you will never run into the issues that I mentioned and other issues that we will talk about a little bit later. So basically, the point is that you can use Selenium IDE to get a little bit familiar with how it helps you to identify elements, but overall, it's not the best tool for the job. The best tool for our job is going to be Firebug on Firefox browser, and we're going to learn how to use that tool like excellent automation engineers. So with all of that said, let's go into the types of different locators that we can use to identify our objects. And those include an ID, a class name, a name, link text, partial links text, XPath, CSS selector, and DOM, which stands for Document Object Model, which if any of you have ever used QTP, you may be familiar with it. If not, no big deal. We'll learn about it here. So let's talk about these guys one at a time. The ID. The ID is the best way to identify an element because it's always unique. If an element has an ID, then you can identify it and be certain that that element will almost never change. So if you're working with developers and you are in a modern company that likes to be progressive and make good advances, you can ask your developers to give you elements with IDs so that it can make your job easier, right? If you can spend 1 minute identifying an element as opposed to 15 minutes, that's a significant advantage per element. For example, here this element is going to have an ID, and you can see that it has an ID, and using this ID you can identify it. This element that I just highlighted does not have an ID, and therefore you can see the XPath that appeared here is extremely complicated. And so to identify this is going to be much harder than to identify something with an ID. So let's get a little bit familiar with Firebug. So if I click this button here and come over here and click this button on the automation practice page, you guys can see how first it's highlighted in the HTML, and second up here, this is the XPath that shows how to identify the element. Now, don't worry about that yet, but notice this value, okay? This is how you identify an element with an ID, and this is how an identification of an element looks without an ID. Which one is looking simpler? This one or that one? I'll go with the first choice. So my point about IDs is that they are the best element to use for identifying your object. Now let's go ahead and actually transition that to C# and Selenium WebDriver. So if you guys go to my code, to Anat Valad Light Palm Framework tutorial, and then what you can do is, if you have a GitHub account, you can obviously clone. If you don't, you can just download the zip file. Download the zip file, extract the code, and you'll be able to follow along in this tutorial. So that's what I have here in the Solution Explorer under Element Identification Test in QTP Tests project. You guys can see here I have a bunch of element identifiers that we're going to go through for Selenium WebDriver, because that's our ultimate goal, right, is to master this thing. So if we want to find an element using an ID, we need to do this. So I'm going to do Control-KU to uncomment, and we can run this test. Now, here on top in the test, I set up a static driver that's going to open up Chrome for us, a element called element, and then a locator, which are used further below. So the first step that we do in our test is we go to a URL, which is our web page, and then we find the element using that ID, and then we click on it. And then the other thing that we need to do is go back, because once we click on the element, we want to go back to that element. So we'll actually debug through this so that you guys can see what's happening. So I'm going to go ahead, click here, and then do debug, and then it's going to run up to this point. So I get my unit test runner here. Let me pin it. Here comes Chrome. I'm going to put it on the side, and then my Visual Studio on the left side. Now this page opened. This line right here uses the driver that we created up here on top. It's a static one, so we don't need to recreate it again. It has a find element method using a locator called ID. And which button do we want to click on? Well, let's take a look at our Firefox. I'm actually clicking on this button here. So if I select it, its ID is example. And you guys can actually see here in the HTML, remember what we learned? Here is the property and here's its value. And that's exactly what we want. We're using this ID and its value is ID example. And so I just put that in here. And then if we're successful, it should click on that button. So I'm going to go ahead and step over this. Now we have this element stored in a variable. And you guys can see all the information about it in here. Something like even a text, no text. And then we can step over this and it's going to perform a click action. And look at that. You guys see that? It clicked on it on button success. And it was successful at clicking. And now this action here is going to take us back. Step over. And that's going to use the browser to take us back. Fantastic. I'm going to stop that. So now that you guys saw the command, I would like to explain it a little more so that you guys can see how really easy it is with C# and Selenium WebDriver. So if you ever want to find any element, you just need your driver, right? And so now using the driver, you just hit dot and it gives you the IDE that helps you out. And you always want to just find element or find elements. Look, two methods. Whether find elements we'll get to in the future, but you also can see that there's actually a reference that tells you what it does. But we want to find an element because it finds the first iWeb element using the given method. So once we hit enter here, now this is asking us for a by class so that we can pass in which type of locator we are going to use. So all you have to do is type in a capital by. And now you can see in the IDE there are many options. You can do it by class name, CSS, ID, link text name, partial link text tag name, XPath. See that? All of those are the different bys, and that's actually what we're going over. And since we're learning how to identify by ID, that's what I'm going to select. And as always, remember there's documentation over here on the right side. So once you hit enter, it's going to ask you for a string, and it's the ID that you want to use to find. So I am simply going to pass in the string that we want. And that string, as always, comes from our Firefox. And using the handy Firebug, I hover over the button that I want to click. And then I can see that the ID is example. You can double click that. You can copy it. Go back to your Visual Studio and you can paste it. And then, of course, don't forget the semicolon. And that is how you get to find an element. Now, the good practice that I like is actually store it in a variable, and then you can use that variable to do what you want, something like a click or a send keys or whatever. Other people just like to maybe, rather than do this, once they found the element, they can actually go ahead and add more methods here, right? You can go ahead and do a click here, or you can clear, or you can check different properties of that element. You can submit, and so on and so forth, right? You can do that in one line. I actually like to do it in 2 lines because it makes it easier to debug. Right? If you, for whatever reason, screwed up identification of this element, when you add it to watch or hover over it, you'll be able to see that because maybe the text or something about it looks off and you realize it and you're like, oh crap, this isn't the element I want. But that's just a preference. So let's talk about a class name. Class name is obviously the name of the attribute, and it's okay, not as good as an ID, and use it only if you must. Sometimes it may be unique, sometimes it's not. That's for you to figure out whether it gives you a unique identifier. So, for example, if we come back to our automation testing practice page, and we hover over this button that says click this button using class, this one has a class. So you guys can see here that its attribute is named class and then its value is button class example. So if we take this value and we come over to our Selenium IDE And rather than doing this, I'm going to do it for you guys from scratch. We'll do the standard driver dot. First, let me set it equal to a variable. Var equals, actually we don't even need to because I created a private element up here. So all we have to do is element equals, we don't have to declare it, driver dot find element by how class name, and supply the value, and then scroll over here, put the semicolon. Let me come back here, uncomment that so that it navigates back, and let me comment this so that it doesn't do that. Control KC is quickly to comment. You can also just highlight, go to edit, advanced, and comment selection. Okay, that's in Visual Studio 2015. I think in the other ones it's a little bit different because I think in 2013 it was like Control CU or something. I forget. It's annoying how they always change it, but that's what it is for me now. But you guys can do it through the advanced edit. Anyway, so now we have that set. So if I run this, and actually let's do a debug. I'm going to do debug. Pulls up our unit test runner. Then it pulls up the browser. So now we're here. If we step over this, we're going to have our element stored. You guys can see we can look at it easily right here. That's why I like that two-line technique. You can see its size, tag name input, text doesn't have any text, whatever else. And now if we hit, oops, and of course I forgot to do the click. So one nice thing about Visual Studio is it allows you sometimes to edit on the fly in debugging mode. So if I do element.click, put that in there, so now it's going to click. And you see right now this arrow is pointing to this line. I can actually move it up one, like that. So now it's going to do this line instead. So I'm going to step over. And now it clicked, and check it out, button success. Because it was button success, it means it clicked on the right button. And now we can just go ahead and do an F5 to run through everything. And the reason I did the F5 is because I added a test cleanup method here at the end of the test so that it does a driver.close and the driver.quit. And let me pin this over here so that it stops bothering me. Excellent. And so the driver.close and the driver.quit, you can see this one closes the current window, quitting the browser. And then the quit quits this driver, closing every associated window. Excellent. So I'm going to save that. So the next property that we can use is the name property. Again, not as good as IDE. IDE is always the best, but if you must use it, just make sure that it's unique. The hardest thing for Selenium WebDriver is always finding that unique combination of elements to help you identify the appropriate element and not anything else. You want just enough properties to make the element unique, but not too many so that you are just wasting time. So let's go back to our website and take a look. This button uses the name property. So we can use, again, Firebug, hover over it and click on that. And you guys can see that it has name called name example. So I'm going to copy that property. I'm going to come over here, get rid of all this. And again, I want to do this for you guys on the fly with less explanation. So see how I did that? Uncomment this, Control KU, and then comment this, Control KC. And now let's go ahead and run it. And of course I didn't click. Let's do and if we're successful, it's going to click on this button. And why won't it click on any other button? Because I have specifically made this unique, right? Look at all these buttons are exactly the same. They just have different content in the tags. So look at this one. And now let's look at the third one. And the first one is also different. It just has an ID. So you guys can see the second one has a class. The one below doesn't. They're both type submits. Their values are obviously different because I wanted to show you guys what each button does. And then this one has a name property and this one does not. So obviously they're almost the same. The text is also a little bit different. I could have made them all exactly the same and just change one of the properties. But either way, you can see how if we identified our element correctly, it will only click on this button and not the other button, not the second button. So let's open up our Visual Studio, and I'm actually just going to go ahead, come here and do a run so that you guys can see everything in real time. So you guys can see it started running the test. Here's the browser. And actually, it was too fast for you guys to be able to see the test run, right? But you can see that the test passed. No errors were thrown. Therefore, the test worked. So that's how we know that it worked. I wish it was a little bit slower, but it's okay. I think you guys get the point that it worked. Otherwise, it would have thrown an exception like oops, check it out. It would throw no such element exception. You guys see that over here? No such element exception. No such element exists. So that's how you know that your element wasn't found. And then if you're looking at the stack trace, you can actually figure out where that happened at line 33 over here. So this finding the element broke, which is exactly the problem because I made up this name. And so there is no such object with this name. And so it was not found. So the next identifier that we can use in Selenium WebDriver is called link text. And it's exactly as it sounds. It's using the text of the link to identify an element. Now, what this implies is that there needs to be a link. Therefore, if you want to do this for a button without a link, that's probably not going to work, or something like a web edit, right? That is not going to work for you. So for example, if we want to click on this link using its link text, which is in here, click me using this link text, right? We're going to come here, copy over this value from Firebug, go to our Visual Studio, and we can uncomment all of this, which I have prepared for you guys. Control KU, or as always, you can come here, edit, advanced, uncomment selection, Control KU. Uncomment that, comment this. Let's run it. And if it's successful, it is going to click on this link, which takes us to a link success page. Okay? So let me go back. And I am just going to shortcut keys. Actually, I'll show you guys a different way to run it. You can just right click and do run tests or Control RT. And that's exactly what I'm going to do. The test is going to run. It will be quick again. But hopefully you guys will see that switch to the other page. Click the link, link success, test is done. And it should become green over here so that you guys will see it was successful. And I'm not sure why it failed. And actually did not fail. It's my mistake, guys. Over here on the left side, this is ReSharper's unit test runner. And the way I ran it was using Visual Studio's unit test runner. See that? 2 options here, 2 options here. This is ReSharper's, and ReSharper's showing the old run, right? Remember when we had line 33 fail? This is line 40 now. So we can rerun it just like this. And I'm just going to go ahead and click here. And now we see that, and there it goes. And this result should now be updated. Excellent. The test passed. And now you know how to find elements using link text. One thing that I quickly wanted to try was to see what would happen if, instead of using link text, we used the text of not a link. So I'm going to copy the text of this button. And this button does take you somewhere, but I'm not using the link text because this is not a link element. Well, check it out. This A right here that tells you that it's a link, right? The A tag tells you that it's a link. The other one wasn't an A tag, it's an input tag. So let's put that in here instead so that it's looking for the button. And what do you guys think will happen? Think about it. You thought about it? Great. Now let's go ahead and run it and see. If you said that it would not work, you were absolutely correct. And this is for the exact same reason as before. No such element exception, because Selenium just was not able to find that element, because there is no element that has this in their link text. It looks like this, but this text right here is replaced with this text right here. There's no link that exists like that, so Selenium just cannot find it. Before we proceed to the next identifier, I quickly wanted to mention that these commands here for Selenium don't really change much from binding to binding, meaning that if you're using Ruby, Python, Java, whatever, these commands don't really change, which is what makes Selenium so cool, because no matter which language you're using, you can easily go from place to place and be able to use Selenium WebDriver. The only thing that changes is like little conventions, right? Because this is C# specific, but if you're like using Ruby or Python or Java, only the conventions change, like the naming conventions and some other things that Java or whatever language you're using does differently. But the methods like find element, find elements, the by, all of that stays pretty static throughout the different language bindings. And so migrating between them becomes really easy. So you can actually utilize these techniques that I'm teaching you for whatever language you want. You don't have to have Visual Studio. All you need is these commands executed on your driver class, and then you'll be able to do exactly what I'm doing on whatever Selenium binding you choose to use. So let's move on to the next identifier, which is going to be partial link text. So that's exactly as it sounds, using not the full link text, but just the partial link text. So if we comment this out and come here, uncomment this, so, and then go back to Firefox and see that link, it said click me using the link text. Instead, we're just going to put in click me here. And so I'm going to debug up to here, right click, debug unit tests. It's going to start running. It's going to run up to here, and then hopefully it clicks. Awesome. So as you see, that worked, and it did click on the link, and you guys saw it switch to the page. And basically the advantage of this is, rather than using this whole string, which is actually wrong, this isn't the right element, instead of using this whole string right here, you can just use click me. Or you can probably even use using this link, depending on what you need, what your requirements are. Sometimes you may only want one word out of an entire link, right? If we have like 5 of these links that are the same, but this one says, click me if you love QTP, click me if you love Selenium, click me if you love UFT, or click me if you are a cool guy. And maybe the only thing that changes is, right, the QTP, the UFT, the Selenium, cool guy. So those values you just want to click on if it contains Selenium or QTP, and so on and so forth. That's how you can utilize that partial link text identifier. This guy right here. And that's again standard of the by class in Selenium. And again, these are very simple objects that we're going through right now, and we'll get into more complicated scenarios where you guys will become experts at identifying everything. The next Selenium WebDriver identifier that I want to talk about is the CSS selector, which basically allows us to use CSS commands to navigate through the HTML. Now, why the CSS selector is good is because it's easier to write and it looks simpler. However, there are some problems with it, is that it's not available on some older browsers. And maybe over a specific period of time, in a few months, maybe in a year, this point will not even be relevant because those older browsers will hardly be in the picture. But that is one of the cons, and therefore usually there is a competition between CSS and XPath, right? People are like, oh, use CSS, no, use XPath, use CSS, XPath, whatever. I think it doesn't really matter which one you use. I prefer XPath because, first of all, it is available on all browsers, and the conventions are not as hard to learn for XPath as they are for CSS. Just because XPath is a little bit more intuitive with its conventions. And also, there are two resources that I want to point you to, guys, that you may want to make yourselves aware of. So first, there's saucelabs.com/resources/selenium/CSS-selectors, where they talk about identification using CSS. And they actually give you examples. Right here is XPath. Here's CSS, XPath, CSS, XPath, CSS examples, and they talk about it, and then they actually claim that it's faster. But then there is another resource that I want to show you guys, which is by Dave Hefner. This guy is actually really cool. I suggest you guys check him out. I always read up his blog. He provides a lot of solid content, and he actually did a test to compare the speed of CSS versus XPath, and he compared it on different browsers to see how they compare, and he actually said that XPath is actually faster than CSS. And there are a few other differences, but I actually trust him. And even if CSS is faster than XPath, the differences are so negligible that I don't think it really matters. So I am not going to focus on CSS so much for you guys, because I think it's less relevant than XPath. But if you want to learn more, like I said, there's this CSS tutorial from Sauce Labs, which is excellent, and they can help you guys learn it. But we're going to really focus on XPath and learn on dominating XPath so that you guys can be awesome at identifying elements. Well, either way, let me quickly show you what a CSS identifier would look like. So if we were hovering over this button, you guys see up here that this is an XPath example. This string right here, that's an XPath. I can switch it to CSS, and then I can hover over it again. There you go. And that's a CSS example. Let me hover over this button. See that? See how it's a little bit different? It's just like hashtag ID example. Or like this, dot button class example. Sorry, I actually clicked on that one. Or something like this, which to me is very confusing, but those are the identifiers. And that's how it looks. Let's try to use it in Selenium WebDriver. So first I want to bring your attention to this button over here, right? I'm going to hover over it. And this is the CSS that is provided to me by Firebug, this value right here. So that's what I can use as my CSS. Now we also have many other options, right? Do you guys see what we can do here? It's a link, so we can use link text. You guys see that? We can use partial link text. We can use the href property, but if you use the href property, I think that's going to click on many links. I can show you guys that later. Or we can use the class, which may be unique, but it's actually not, because you guys can see that because of this identifier, there are two buttons being highlighted. You guys see that? 1, 2. So this identifier is actually not unique. So the CSS would normally look like this, and by CSS selector, you just pass that value in. But that is not unique enough for us to click on only this button. Therefore, we cannot use it. So rather than teaching you a CSS way of identifying this, we will learn to identify this using XPath. All right, my friends, so let's talk about the next identifier that we're going to use to locate our web elements, and that's called XPath. XPath is a very phenomenal way that we're going to locate our elements because it helps us to locate the elements even when there are no unique properties. I mean, there are almost always unique properties, but a lot of times using something simple like link text or an ID or a name is not possible. And so that's when we use XPath to dig down to the element exactly that we want. The standard definition for XPath is that it's a standard navigation tool for XML. However, XML and HTML are very similar for those of you that know what XML looks like. And you guys just learned what HTML looks like. And basically, XML looks exactly the same, except for XML was developed to convey data, and HTML was developed to display data. So kind of a different purpose of each one, but they're both structurally very similar. In fact, almost the same, minus a few key differences. So if you look at a standard HTML, that's what XML looks like. But anyways, because of that, those similar structures, we can navigate HTML using XPath. So let me show you guys some examples. Let's pull up our friendly qtptutorial.net/automation practice page. And then I'm going to come over here, grab this highlighting tool, and I can hover over this button. And rather than using CSS here, I'm going to select XPath. Rehighlight again. And you guys can see here that this is the XPath that was provided to me by the tool. When I highlighted this element, this is the XPath that was given. And now this XPath, you can see it's pretty long, right? So what it does is it digs down into each of these sections until we get to the right place. So for example, it starts with this ID post. So that comes up all the way up to here, right? So then it takes the next child and comes in here and then in there and then inside of here. And see how it keeps getting, the area keeps getting smaller, and then inside of that area is something else, and then inside of that area is something else, and then inside of this area is a button, and inside of that is finally our click me link that we want to click upon. So this is what's called a relative XPath, but it's a very long relative XPath. An absolute XPath would actually start at the very top and then keep drilling down. This one skips a few divs. It skips a lot of divs, and it actually starts at this post ID. But an absolute XPath would start all the way here and then keep coming down until it gets all the way down to that element right there. So absolute XPath is obviously the easiest way to identify our element. The problem is that it's very long and that any change in the structure will break the locator. So for example, if you look at these two buttons, let me highlight this button and then take this, Control A, Control C to copy it over into my notepad. Put that over here for you guys. And then, so that's this button, right? Button number 1. Let me put button number 2. Now, check out these two buttons compared to each other. Do you guys see how they're almost exactly the same? The only difference is that this is form 2 and this is form 1. Their location is different in the website because one is above another. But what if I was to move this button over here on the side, or move this XPath 2 button on top, or move it way on top, or even get rid of this one? If that were to happen, this would no longer be true. Because, right, if you imagine that this is the button that we want, but now this button got moved down here, this would be its new address. You can think of this as like the home address, right? If we want to go to this house, the family in that house has moved to a different place. When you come here, you're not going to find the family that you want because you have their exact address. Instead, what you need is a relative way to figure out where the family lives and then go to that location. Right? And that something, a good analogy there is if you had the family's phone number that you wanted to visit and you say, hey, what's your address? And then they would tell you whether it's this one or this one. It wouldn't matter. But that's where relative XPaths come in and help us make our jobs much easier rather than using absolutes. And absolutes, like I said, are very easy, but they are bad and dangerous. And when elements get shuffled around, which they always do unless you're working on a really bad application that never changes, you should use relative XPaths. Okay, so don't use absolutes. They're just good to know, but we're going to learn how to use relative XPaths extremely well.